Thanks, Kim, and thanks to Heritage, and thanks to all of you for having me. Kim did tell me that even though originally I only had 15 or 20 minutes to help kick off this panel, he said if I would give details on agriculture, and particularly detasseling corn and walking beans, I could have an extra hour. So you're all going to be privileged to get into some serious agricultural stuff. He also was complimenting my boots, which I appreciated, and he asked what's up with that. He didn't realize that Nebraska is the largest beef state in the union. He then wanted to ask technical questions about beef versus cattle and whether or not Texans in the room would be offended at my claims. So we're also going to do a little bit of parsing about how you go from a cow-calf season in Texas and you migrate north to slaughter in Nebraska. This gets me an extra hour of bonus time to unpack ag as well. You have a really distinguished panel, and there are a whole bunch of technical things that you're going to learn from them and that I'm looking forward to learning from them as well. I'm not going to try to compete with that. There are a whole bunch of aspects to the way we do counterintelligence, and we do border security, and we do drug interdiction, and we do human trafficking partnerships, or anti-human trafficking partnerships with Mexico, that I think you're going to hear unpacked by your really distinguished panel this afternoon. And I won't speculate on that and the implications of the timing and the unfolding of NAFTA negotiations for the Mexican election. But I would just flag that that's a very significant thing that I don't think has been covered in the US media accounts of what's happening in NAFTA as well. So there's a lot to be discussed this afternoon. I'm going to limit myself to setting the backdrop for some of this discussion. And with limited time, I'm going to give you something more approaching a listicle as the kickoff for my talk, and then I'll unpack it in just a little more detail. But I'd like to sort of offer 6 theses for your consideration. The first is that when we discuss trade, and our broader topic today is the relationship between economic partnerships and military partnerships across the globe, but especially in North America. When we discuss trade, the American people right now regularly jump to job change and job disruption, and there's a basic true fact that we should all have in common that we don't all have in common, which is that technology, not trade, is overwhelmingly the primary driver of job change and job disruption in America. That is, technology, not trade, is the overwhelming driver of job disruption in America today. Number 2, if you look at the effects of trade just from an economic standpoint, we're obviously going to get to national security implications of trade as well today, but if you look at trade just as an economic matter, it has been indisputably good for the US. Throughout history, this isn't academic theory, this is historical reality, and NAFTA in particular has been indisputably good for the US. It's also been indisputably good for Mexico, and it's also been indisputably good for Canada, and there's nothing internally inconsistent about those statements because trade done right is a win-win. And regularly in our public discourse, we don't talk about that clearly. So I think it's useful to unpack a little bit when you look at the economic ledger, how to think about the consumer benefits of trade, the producer benefits of trade, and then in reverse, if you look at more tariffs or more protection, the consumer costs of trade, the producer costs of trade, and then the retaliatory synergistic effects where you get costs again on consumers and producers as you cascade from one kind of protectionism to other types of protectionism. So my second thesis for you is that trade is indisputably good as an economic matter. Number 3, we have very little public understanding of what the term trade deficit means, and not understanding what a trade deficit is has huge negative consequences for our public deliberation about trade. So we should talk just a tiny little bit about what the term trade deficit means, and really we should fight hard, and I think for those of us who are in public life for a time, or those who are in the academic or the think tank world, or those of you in the journalistic community, I think we should regularly stop whenever someone says trade deficit and say, when you say trade deficit, do you really just mean trade product deficit? Because I assume that you do, but if we're going to talk about that, then let's make sure we also get back to the trade services surplus and the foreign direct investment surplus that the U.S. almost always has whenever we talk about a bilateral trade product deficit. So number 3, the term trade deficit is not well understood, and we can't deliberate well as a people about trade without unpacking a little bit about what we think we're saying when we say trade deficit. Number 4, The American people are not to blame for this confusion. This is overwhelmingly the fault of leaders to not talk clearly about where we are in economic history. And unless we go slower and we unpack where we are in economic history, there is going to be so much anxiety about job churn and job change, understandably, that people are going to look for boogeymen. And right now, trade is suffering a lot of the boogeyman negative consequences of us not deliberating clearly about where we are in economic history, because we are going through a time of radical change. The technological and in particular digital revolution that we are living through may well 100 years from now look in the rearview mirror as disruptive, not just to economics, but to basic human community as industrialization and urbanization. And if we're going through that kind of a revolution, we should have some sense of what we're living through so that we as a people can deliberate about it clearly. And this town is failing radically to have any meaningful discussion about where we are in economic history. And so a lot of what feels like Washington breaking down is Washington breaking down at the basic level of policy deliberation, but more fundamentally, it's Washington not having done the first thing of leading to help the American people have a big, broad conversation about what we think, what sort of problems are amenable to political solutions, and what sort of problems are probably not amenable to political solutions. When we unpack that, what I would say is that we're going through a time where there's such radical erosion of social capital, radical and rapid, that most people feel such hollowness in our lives. And as people who are meant to be relational beings, as people who are meant to be tribal beings, if our tribes are evaporating, we're still going to try to figure out a way to create tribe. And a really lame way to create tribe is by doing anti-tribe. But that's what's happening all around us, where people are saying, well, I don't have a lot of tribe, but maybe I can at least have the enemy of my enemy be my friend for a time, and we can be shared in what we're anti to. And right now there's a whole bunch of that going on, which is some of the reason that Washington doesn't look like it makes much progress on pragmatic, small ball legislative policymaking, because there's not a broader shared understanding of where we are in history. Number 5, and this is more than the McDonald's thesis of Sam Huntington and other people, but number 5, I would say that when you have lots of economic relationship between two countries or between a block of countries, when you have a lot of commerce between peoples, you end up building other kinds of relationships as well, which often have huge global security implications. This isn't really that profound. It turns out that you're less likely to go to war with people that you know and like and have shared interests with. There's really nothing profound about this, but when we talk about trade and we isolate it from global security and national security considerations, we're pretending that people are just disembodied, rational robot sort of calculators making decisions about what their interests are in the world, as if they aren't embodied people that have economic interests and communities and relationships and friends. And it turns out when you have a lot more economic relationship, you're much more likely to find shared understanding about global security matters, both for the good, sort of building alliances, but also for the avoidance of the bad. Misunderstandings tend to be dealt with better if you have lots of overlapping relationships. To take it from some of the literature about family breakdown that's out there right now, it turns out that people who have to practice marriage in the context of community are better at marriage than people who practice marriage without a lot of relationships densely packed around them. It turns out if you have a bunch of little bumps in your marriage, but you share lots of common friends, and you have family members, and you have neighbors, it turns out you can solve lots of problems that might otherwise spin out of control. The same is true in economic and military security. And 6th and finally, and reaching far beyond just our NAFTA discussions today, we should be clear about where we are in geopolitical competition over the coming decades. China has a plan, and we don't have a plan. China has a plan for where they would like to see global economic relations and global security relations go, and the United States right now surely doesn't look like we have a plan. Again, those 6 theses are far more than enough that I promise I won't be able to finish on time, but I'll try to go very fast back through them, and then we'll take a few questions, and then Kim will pull me from the stage. So back to number 1. It is indisputable that what is happening right now in the disruption of work is a consequence primarily of technology, not primarily of trade. Trade is a big deal. I don't think there's anybody in the US Senate that is more pro-trade than I am. I think trade has immense human benefits. And yet, trade is not really what's driving most of the anxiety people feel right now. And we need to be clearer about what is happening economically. So by analog, let's look at what happened to agriculture over the last century and a quarter, and then what is now happening to industrial, I think of them as big tool, economy jobs. Because if we understood the analogy to agriculture, we would know how ridiculous it is to talk like we're trying to make America 1950 again. No one is ever going to make America 1950 again in terms of large-scale industrial jobs, and no one is ever going to make America 1850 again in terms of agricultural jobs, and none of us would think that we would want that. So in 1900, 41% of American workers worked on the farm. Today, it's well under 2%. Total agricultural output is off the charts higher in terms of quantity and quality than 118 years ago. 41% of Americans on the farm in 1900, more than that still lived and worked on the farm. Urbanization is happening, but as a matter of work, 41% of American workers are on the farm in 1900. Today, less than 2%, more total output. What's happening in manufacturing? Because the rhetoric in this town where politicians always lie and pretend they can fix whatever big bit of anxiety you have, we're going to bring back industrial factory jobs from the 1950s. No, we're not. That is simply not true. It's not what's going to happen, and there's no economic theory to defend that rubbish. The high watermark of industrial employment in US history was in the mid-1950s, where 31% of American workers worked in factories. Today, 7% of American workers work in factories, and there's more total output in terms of both quantity and quality. The shape of the curve from the agricultural revolution, and I don't mean the agricultural revolution of Mesopotamia 11,000 years ago, I mean tech substitution at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the shape of the curve is really similar. From 41% to 2% in industrial jobs, we've gone from 31% to 7%, and the shape of that curve is going to continue to go down. The way that it goes down matters a lot to particular families' lives, and we should have bigger discussions about what that looks like, but we should start by understanding where we are in history. Transition to the second point. When you talk about protectionism as if it's going to protect those jobs, you don't have any theory to defend your position, and you don't have any history to defend your position. So here's what actually happens when there's more protectionism, and let's talk in a little bit of detail about the current steel tariffs idea. Here's what happens if we put these steel tariffs in place. Consumers lose. Whenever there are more tariffs, which just means tax on consumers, whenever there are more tariffs, consumers on both sides of a border lose, because you're telling voluntary parties who wanted to make something and sell it, and another voluntary party that wanted to make something and buy it, that they can't go through with that transaction. A government is going to stand between you and say, we want less of these transactions, and so we're going to put taxes in here to disincentivize this transaction. Consumers on both sides always lose whenever there's more protection, because there were voluntary choices people wanted to make for higher quality, lower cost goods that they're now prohibited from making because of some policymaker. That's register one of the equation. Register two of the equation is, well, what happens to the protected industry and to other domestic industries that need that industry as an input, pardon me. I'm going to come back to that in just a second, because the assumption most Americans make is that, well, consumers may lose from protectionism, but producers must win, and so then we net out whether or not this equation is on net good. That's not true, but I'm going to come back to the question about the equation around producers and steel. Then the third register in the equation is retaliatory stuff. So when we decide to put protective tariffs in place, we can be sure, because it's always what has happened, that there will be retaliatory tariffs against the US. As recently as a couple months ago, when we decided to put tariffs in place against washing machines and against solar panels, what did China target? They targeted sorghum. And there are specific farmers in my state who've come into my office and talked to me about what's happened to their marketplace and to the futures markets in their place, in their space. So retaliatory tariffs are inevitable, and that we always lose in that register 3 as well. Now, the only thing that's disputable is what happens in Register 2. So let's talk about the steel industry in America. How many steel workers do you think there are? You don't need to shout it out, but sort of take a guess in your head. How many people do you think work in production steel in the United States? 140,000. How many people do you think work in industries that use steel as a primary input for their factory jobs? 5.5 million. The steel tariffs that we're talking about in Washington, D.C. will kill jobs in America in steel. So consumers always lose with protectionism. Retaliated against industries always lose with protectionism, but even the politicians' rhetorical lie that they're going to save steel jobs, it's not true. You're going to cost steel jobs with these tariffs. The only question is how many. There are 2 studies that have been done so far trying to model what happens with these protective tariffs, and they have between 6-to-1 and 13-to-1 job loss. So The Economist had a piece out last week called The President's War with Adam Smith, and their analysis says that it's going to be 13 lost jobs for every job preserved in the steel industry. There's a bigger modeling that's been done that speculates there'll be 33,000 saved steel production jobs and 179,000 lost jobs, so a net loss of 146,000. You look back to the steel tariffs at the end of George Bush 43's first administration. The administration knew by the 11th month that they were losing jobs in the industry they were seeking to protect with their steel tariffs. So second point here is, indisputably, trade is good for America overall, and trade is good for workers, even in the industries we're seeking to protect. That doesn't change the fact that there are bad actors out there. China is doing bad things with a bunch of their oversupply in general in industries and in steel in particular. Here's the good news. When the U.S. uses dispute resolution mechanisms that already exist, we almost always win. When we go to the WTO, we win more than 90% of the time. Steel tariffs against China's bad practices have led to a reduction on the order of 2/3, slightly more than 2/3 probably, over the last 48 months, because we've been targeting certain Chinese bad practices. And it turns out, when we're concerned about other Chinese bad practices, the best way to move forward is with other people who believe in the rule of law and getting them to come together with us through extant organizations to try to defend anti-tariff behavior and attack non-tariff barriers as well. But all of that would assume that we have enough shared literacy to understand what's happening in trade. And here's one of the big problems we have. The term trade deficit sets off bells in people's minds that we're losing in some definable way because someone else is cheating. Sometimes there is cheating, and we should be vigorous and vicious in our response, but we should be public and deliberate. We shouldn't make up a national security clause as a way to try to do something when there's specific bad action by China that we can resolve through mechanisms that already exist in a rule of law order. So here's the problem with trade deficit. We have a picture in our mind of what trade deficit means, and if you go to Mexico and you go into a retail store, it is true that you're not going to find a whole bunch of products made of plastic and steel that have stamped "Made in the USA" on the bottom. When you go into a Walmart 10 miles from here, you're going to find lots of plastic and steel products that have "Made in Mexico" stamped on the bottom of them. So, is the U.S. losing? Are we losing as consumers? Are we losing as producers? We have to go one step deeper down the supply chain. And it turns out if you go to the factory in Mexico that's supplying a lot of the plastic and steel stuff that is sold in their retail stores and sold in our Walmarts, the big machines in those factories in Mexico are probably made in the United States. What does that mean? It means that they're loaded up with services surplus. They have U.S. accounting in those machines. They have U.S. engineering in those machines. They have U.S. lawyering in those machines. They have U.S. product design in those machines. They have U.S. finance in those machines. So the export of that machine carried with it a whole bunch of services surplus, and the dollars that we're spending to buy stuff that come off that assembly line in Mexico are reinvested in the U.S. in terms of foreign direct investment that allows us to advance the next generation of those higher-end machines. The failure of Washington to have a big discussion with the American people about what is actually happening in the economy has huge negative implications for our economics, for our civil society, and for our national security. Because ultimately, the people need to be told the truth. The people deserve to be told an honest answer about where we are in economic history. The people need not to be lied to, saying we're going to make it 1950 again, because it's not true, and it's not going to help the specific workers in the specific disrupted industries, and it sure as heck isn't going to help their kids to be told that the primary problem they face is that they're a victim of other people who are cheating them. That's not true. What's actually needed for the United States and for our workers and for our educational system, which needs to be radically upgraded, is to prepare for the more nimble economy of the future, which is inevitable. I was born in 1972. Average duration at a firm in the 70s was 26 years. Average duration at a firm today is 4 years and change. Where do we talk about this? The number one driver of uninsurance in America, health uninsurance, is job change. The public has no idea. When you survey the American people, why do we have so much, why is uninsurance so much greater in 2010 than in 1990? Because a radical increase in health uninsurance in America. You know what the public thinks? There are two big answers: socioeconomic status and health status. But we don't have more sick people, and we don't have more poor people. So why do we have more uninsured people? Because you tend to be uninsured for 4 to 6 months every time you change jobs. And once you're changing jobs every 4 years, it means you're uninsured 1/8 of the time. That's not a small problem. That's a structural problem that means when you get the breast cancer diagnosis, when you have the car accident, there's a 12% chance that you're going through a period of structural uninsurance that means you're the uninsurable population. You're the people with the pre-existing conditions 5 and 10 and 15 years from now. We should talk honestly about that. The reality is we need to create a mobile economy where we rethink the architecture of industrial era job benefits from the mid-1960s. Because we're not going back to the 1950s and 1960s, no matter how much anybody wanted to. The only thing this city has really gotten done in the last half century in terms of upgrading the social compact and the assumptions we make about where our benefits come from is defined benefit retirement plans. Until 1986, we still had an assumption that everybody would have a defined benefit pension for their whole life from their one firm that was their cradle to grave or their high school retirement or college, high school graduation or college graduation until retirement experience. But that's not what people go through. When I was a college president, we would look at survey data on what did we know about the graduates of that year? What was the current expectation? The average college graduate in 2014, the last year I was a college president, the average graduate of our college could assume that they were going to change not just jobs, but industries 3 times in their first decade post-college. We need to radically rethink what it looks like to be a nimble worker for the 21st century, and that starts by telling the truth about how fast AI and machine learning are going to disrupt this economy. The McKinsey study, I used to work at McKinsey, and at the McKinsey Global Institute, they had a report come out in November of 2017 that I highly recommend to you. They spent about 18 months modeling 46 countries, 91% of global GDP, and 800 job categories. 91% of global GDP. And their prediction, based on their modeling, is that 55% of total economic tasks in the global economy today will be disrupted inside 12 years based on already available AI. This is not 2 chess moves from some new technology that may be created in 2021 and be applied by 2029. This is based on AI that exists today. What share of global economic jobs are disrupted inside the next 12 years? That's not to say, mind you, that 55% of jobs evaporate. This is 55% of tasks, which means when you bundle and unbundle current jobs, they speculate that 60% of today's jobs are more than 30% automatable. That tends to set off bells in people's minds that make the assumption that nobody is going to be able to have any stability in a job. That's not true, but you're probably not going to have any stability in a job if you don't plan to upskill as you go forward in your career. This is what ATMs did that surprised Americans in the 1970s and 80s. Right? My mom, farm kid, coming off the farm, didn't go to college, didn't know anybody who'd really gone to college in her family, and she became a bank teller soon after graduating from high school, and this is in the late 1960s. The ATM is created in 1967 in London and starts coming to the US in 1969-70. The assumption at the time was that ATMs are going to upend all of these teller jobs in America. You know what actually happened over the next 30 years? a pretty significant expansion in the number of tellers in America. Why? Because it turned out tellers did a whole bunch of different things, and most of their time was spent on really, really low-value tasks, like recounting the money in their drawer and trying to match it with their book at the end of the day, and counting it over and over and over again. And it turns out machines are much better than this at people. But tellers at that point were almost a 100% female job. Loan officers were almost a 100% male job. You know what happened over the course of the 20 years that the ATM came to the US? The average bank went from needing 21 tellers to needing less than 13. And what that led to was a radical expansion in the number of branches and franchises that banks could afford to open. And what happened was women climbing the career ladder and beginning to take over more and more of the tasks that had been loan officer jobs as they started to sell investment products and sign people up for credit cards and all sorts of different products that seemed to be well beyond the historic role of a teller. It reoriented things in ways that no central planner could have ever predicted, but ultimately in ways that led to the greater service of banks to lots of people across the economy, but also lots more career opportunities for people. I think the McKinsey study suggests that similar things will happen in our time. Lots of jobs that look like they might evaporate might actually climb the ladder of productive value for your neighbor. All of this points us forward, and I'll move toward wrapping up here, points us forward to what are the global security implications of this. We are in a geopolitical competition with primarily China. But what we should recognize is our three, if you think about global security challenges for the US, we tend to bucket them 5 ways. We say Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and have a catch-all category for jihadis. So there's jihadi mess all over the world, but not primarily driven by a particular set of nation-state actors. When you look at the Chinese strategy, the Russian strategy, and the Iranian strategy, ask yourself this question. Do their neighbors like them or not? Why? Why do China's neighbors, Russia's neighbors, and Iran's neighbors not like them? This may seem a little too poetic, it may seem a little too romantic, but because those nations don't believe in souls. We actually believe in universal human dignity. The American idea is premised on a certain set of assumptions about dignity. And so we believe, particularly for the 320 million people that we're all called in this room to serve, but as an anthropological matter, we believe it for 7.5 billion people across the face of the globe. We believe they're created with inherent dignity and that God gives them rights by nature. Government just exists to secure our rights. Government isn't the author or source of our rights. Nobody in Tehran, in Moscow, or Beijing thinks about their economic and military ambitions by talking first about the dignity of their neighbors. They talk about how they can sow chaos among their near neighbors to create a buffer and a barrier against other people getting to them. They think if their near neighbors are weak, they're protected, they're insulated. We believe exactly the opposite. We believe that when our allies are strong, we're strong, and when we're strong, our allies are strong. We don't believe there's a zero-sum game between the US and Canada. We don't believe there's a zero-sum game between the US and Mexico. We actually believe that when Mexico is thriving, there's less chaos on our border. We believe that when Canada is thriving, the global shop floor that is North America means that BMW and Mercedes decide to start manufacturing cars destined for Europe in South Carolina and Alabama. That's pretty extraordinary. If you go to Germany today, the X Series, one of the most common BMWs on the road, the X Series doesn't have any manufacturing in Europe. It's done exclusively in South Carolina. That's amazing. Why does that happen? Because we have a North American global shop floor that produces really high quality, low cost stuff because we don't believe things are a zero-sum game. And so when American public rhetoric starts, when American public rhetoric degrades and declines to the place where someone can say a phrase like, NAFTA's been good for Mexico, and Americans hear in their mind, well, then we must have got taken. We must have negotiated some bad deal, because if NAFTA's been good for Mexico, then we must have lost. That assumes that every deal is a zero-sum game. It's not true of trade. Trade is a win-win. There are deals in the world. If in a real estate deal, if after the deal you find out that your counterparty got a really good deal, then you maybe didn't negotiate that well. Because if that deal went through and your counterparty got a really good deal, you probably left some money on the table. You probably overpaid. But that's not how trade works. And trade is a really good picture of a commerce between peoples who believe in their dignity, who want the best for each other, who want the best for their own consumers and families and producers, and who therefore also end up thinking that military alliances between us are probably good for them and good for us. It's the best bulwark against the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative that you can imagine. But right now, we're doing none of that in this city as we deliberate about what the next century looks like. Thanks for having me.